This QLCP tutorial is about how to configure the QLCP switch inputs and LED outputs for your application. Switch input and LED output configuration is performed using the input jumpers and system configuration dip switch. Let's start with switch input configuration. Typically, all the switches are connected together on one side of the switch contact and attached to the panel COM connector TB2 on the QLCP. This is the panel COM connector TB2. The switches could also be connected to the panel 5-volt connector TB1. The other side of each switch contact is wired to a QLCP input. If a closed switch contact applies 0 volts or COM to the inputs, you need to configure the normal state of the QLCP inputs, the state when the switch is open, to be 5 volts using input jumper JP2 for inputs 1 through 64 and JP1 for inputs 65 through 128. 5 volts is the factory setting for these jumpers. Here we see a normally closed switch configuration that also requires the input jumper to be in the 5-volt position. If a closed switch contact applies 5 volts to the inputs, you need to configure the normal state of the QLCP inputs to be 0 volts or COM by placing the input jumpers in the COM position. Here we see a normally closed switch configuration that also requires the input jumper to be in the COM position. Now there is just one more thing to configure for the switch inputs, and that is the logic state that you want the switches to be in when the switches are opened and closed. The logic state of the switch inputs is configured using switch number 7 of the system configuration dip switch. When dip switch 7 is in the off position, 5 volts applied to a switch input will be transmitted to the interlocking logic controller as a 1 for the associated bit in the serial message. 0 volts applied to the input will be transmitted as a 0. When dip switch 7 is in the on position, the logic state is inverted. 5 volts applied to a switch input will be transmitted as a 0. 0 volts applied to the switch input will be transmitted as a 1. To support the most commonly used switch input configuration shown here, the factory setting for dip switch 7 is in the on position. Now let's configure the LED outputs. LED outputs are configured using switch number 6 of the system configuration dip switch. Typically, all the LED cathodes are connected together to the panel COM connector TB2. The anode of each LED is wired to an LED output. For this LED configuration, dip switch 6 must be in the on position. This is the factory setting. When the LED anodes are connected together to the panel 5-volt connector TB1, and each LED cathode is wired to an LED output, dip switch 6 must be in the off position. The information we just covered is provided in the QLCP developer tool in a simplified table format. Open the tool and click on the Help tab. In the picture of the QLCP, click on the System Configuration Dip Switch. Help information related to the configuration dip switch will be displayed. Here, you can see a table that shows you the positions of dip switch 6 and 7 based on your local control panel wiring for switch inputs and LED outputs. This information is also available in the QLCP user manual, which can be displayed by clicking on the User Manual button. This concludes the tutorial for QLCP switch input and LED output configuration.